Most commander games are lost in the first 3 turns, whether it be mana flooded, mana screwed, no card draw, no ramp. All of these problems stem from the most asked question by new Magic players. What makes an opening hand worth keeping? Looking at an opening hand and knowing what to keep and what not to can be challenging for even experienced players. So how does someone know what to keep and when to mulligan? The simple answer is being able to set up for your commander. And now before we go into that, what are the basic things that your opening hand should have? The first and most important is going to be a good amount of lands. Personally, whenever I'm playing most of my decks, I like to see 3 lands in my opening hand for me to be able to keep it. But that can always change depending on points that I'll get into later. And now another big thing to look at with lands in your opening hand is that if you're in a 3 color or up deck, you want to be able to tap for multiple colors with your lands. If I was playing a Naya deck but I only had 3 planes, I probably would want to mulligan and hope for a hand with more colored lands. I would also recommend having at least one source of card draw if your commander does not draw cards itself. And now back to the main points. Your opening hand should be set up for your commander, but what does that mean? Let's take a look at my Arna Skycaptain deck for an example. Once my opening hand has enough lands and one piece of card draw, what cards am I looking for to fill out the remaining 3 slots? In order, I'm looking for: first, a ram piece, second, cards for my game plan, 3, protection, and 4, extra card draw. For my Arna deck, getting it out as fast as possible is important to making sure that my deck can stay competitive in high-powered games. This means that casting it a turn or even 2 ahead can really swing the game in my favor. This is where signets and other ramp options can really be helpful in speeding up my deck's game plan. And speaking of a deck's game plan, the next thing I am looking for is equipment and aura cards so that Arna can actually do its thing whenever I go to attack with it. There's no point in ramping if I can't even do my deck's thing. I also look for gameplay synergy cards that can help my game plan run smoother. Now, the big thing to watch out for is that gameplay synergy cards don't do anything without an actual card that goes with your game plan. What I mean is, like, Pure Steel Paladin isn't going to do any card draw if I can't cast any equipment spells. Going to the next thing that my Arna deck is looking for in the opening hand is protection. Now, all of my local pods know that Arna is a serious threat that needs to be taken care of quickly once I cast it, so having a protection spell or a counter in hand is always helpful in protecting my board state, and more specifically Arna. And now for this 4th slot, I'm looking for extra card draw. And obviously in my opening hand I only have 3 more slots, so this one goes over, but I see the extra card draw spell as kind of a wild card slot. Like, let's say for instance, I only have 2 lands in my opening hand, but I have the 1 card draw spell that I always look for, and then another one. I might be able to keep that opening hand and just hope that I draw into another land. And this is the logic I use whenever I don't see a good equipment spell in my opening hand, or any good ramp and so on. While extremely risky, I don't think that you should immediately mulligan if the rest of your hand is good and you have 2 card draw spells. And now since Arna does not draw cards itself, having an extra card draw spell in hand can really help reduce the chance of me getting mana screwed or not having any cards in hand when I have to top deck in later turns. On the surface, this is just a basic list of what I'm looking for with my commander decks, but how do we evaluate this into wins? The key is to having a concrete plan of what you're going to cast each turn up until you cast your commander. And now let's go back to what I like to see out of the 3 slots in my opening hand, besides a card draw spell and 3 lands. A way to evaluate my deck synergy is to spread out the game plan throughout each and every other step. What I mean is that I don't have just generic card draw, generic ramp, or even generic protection spells on my deck. I would rather see these through auras and equipments. For example, let's take a card draw spell, Opt, and compare it to something like Combat Research. Both of these cards give me card advantage, but in a Arna deck, Combat Research is infinitely better. While Opt is a one and done type of card, Combat Research in this deck is an aura that builds value over time. Every time I'm copying it off of Arna and dealing combat damage, I'm getting more and more value over a card like Opt, letting me draw even more cards. And this can also be looked at through other spells in the deck like Enter the Enigma, SRAM, all cards that draw me cards while also going directly into my deck's game plan. And this logic can be used on all of the other points too. Gul'vane Pick is a generic if not suboptimal ramp card that turns into a great ramp piece that fits with my deck specifically since I can copy it for even more value. Swiftfoot Boots is a perfect protection spell that I can copy and then equip to other creatures later on, that way my board state is even more protected. Making sure that your deck as a whole is synergistic is one of the first ways to make sure that you're getting better opening hands and to know what to look for. And now a lot of people like to mention to get your deck's mana curve as low as possible, that way you don't get stuck with these high mana spells in your hand. And I'm not going to be deep diving into that in this video, but I do want to hit on a very important subtopic of this point, and it's like I mentioned earlier, knowing what each turn up until you cast your commander should look like. So now how do we do this? First, take your commander. I'll take Arna. Arna is a 5-cost commander that every game I want to have out at least on turn 4. So I know that turn 4 in every game is when I'm planning on casting Arna. Now I can ask myself, what cards do I need to achieve this? And what cards do I want out on the board before I cast it? And now for this, I know that I'm going to need all 3 of my colors, at least 1 ramp piece, to make sure that I can cast Arna on turn 4. And now for this, I'm going to get my colors from the 3 lands in my opening hand, plus an extra land that hopefully I can draw into by turn 4. I also want to get at least 1 ramp piece, where if I only have 2 colors on my opening hand, I can get the 3rd from that ramp piece. And now this makes sure that I know every game just from my opening hand that I'm going to be able to quickly and consistently cast Arna on turn 4. Looking at my deck list, almost all of my ramp options are going to cost 2 mana to cast, meaning that turn 2 will be designated as my usual ramp turn to get ahead on mana. So now turns 2 and 4 are designated solely for either casting Arna or ramping to make sure that I can cast it. So now what am I looking to do on turns 1 and on turn 3? These are my game plan turns. Turn 3 is when I'm usually going to be casting a equipment card. The thought process is that I can get that equipment out on the board, cast Arna turn 4, and then on turn 5, equip it to Arna and start copying it and getting the deck running. Most equipment in the deck is from 2 to 4 casting cost range, which on turn 3 I will be able to cast if I ramped on turn 2 and hit all of my land drops. Going to turn 1, that is going to be a tricky turn. Most good 1-drops that synergize with the game plan are going to cost a decent amount of money to buy, and I would only recommend running good 1-drops in your deck if you plan on the deck being high powered. Now for my Arna deck, which is high powered, this is where I have cards like Sigarda's Aid, Land Tax, and of course Sol Ring, which are just cards that really smooth out how my deck's going to play that game. I would never bank on having a turn 1 play in most decks, but it is something nice to have if you can manage it. And now I really don't like to plan out my turns after Arna is cast just because of how varied a game can be after the crucial turns 4 and 5. I'll never know if someone's able to instantly take out Arna to where I have to recast it on turn 5 or 6, and I also don't know what I'm going to be drawing into. In my experience, the best way to look at an opening hand is to just make sure that you can have the cards that can consistently get your game plan rolling, which in my case is casting Arna and getting auras and equipments out. And now big disclaimer here, but even knowing what a perfect hand for your deck is won't ensure that you aren't going to get mana flooded or run out of cards in a game. Every game of Magic is going to have an element of luck, but knowing what a good opening hand is just helps minimize how often that happens. This is also why I stressed having a good amount of card draw in your deck if your commander doesn't draw cards itself. Being able to consistently draw 3, 4, 5 cards more than your opponents during a game can really make sure that if you don't hit a land or if you don't hit one of your game plan spells, you'll be able to draw into it. For any new players looking for less non-games where they kind of just sit and do nothing the whole time, I would really recommend taking the time to go over and understand what your deck wants in an opening hand, and just see how much better that alone can make your deck.